Thank you for the generous introduction, Jim, Peter. What a pleasure for me to be here to talk to you about something I'm impassioned about data and about big data. I'm mindful of the fact that big data is a big topic, so I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible, and also, under the guidance of Peter, as quickly as possible, so we can get on with the panel where we can all have a conversation about some of these themes. Big data. What is it? Well, let's start here. More. More. If you remember one thing from tonight, please remember this, that sometimes more isn't more. Sometimes more is new. Sometimes more is better. Sometimes more is different. So writing was created about 8,000 BC. And you could imagine that when they had the printing press just at the dawn of it, 1450, there was probably someone who said, the printing press, come on, it's nothing special there. You know, we've had books before, written by scribes. We'll have books now. It's just more books. Nothing new here. Right? Words were fixed into a media before, and they're still fixed again. It's just more. And of course, you'd be totally wrong. Right? Printing, more words, wasn't just more, it was different. You had more words, it allowed for an era of mass literacy. It eroded the authority of the church. It brought down monarchies. It created this mass literacy and therefore, eventually the scientific method, the Enlightenment, the great flourishing of culture. Now we have a new shift taking place. And there's probably some people who would look at your iPad and say, oh, don't worry about that. Nothing really big going on. It's just a continuum, right? It's a linear approach. After all it is more. And I would say, actually, no, it's completely different. When you change the platform by which we're looking at something from analog to digital, where the actual device can take the feedback on what people are doing at all moments, and we'd be able to, the machine will actually know, are you reading very quickly or reading very slowly? Did you all give up at chapter 7, telling the author that maybe he should accelerate it a little bit better, break it up, change the way he's writing? To find out that students perform best when they're reading in the morning and not when they're in the evening, because you can measure the subjects that they've read and test them and give that feedback to the student on an individual basis. Suddenly, what you find out is that more isn't just more. More is new, more is better, and more is different. So let me tell you a story. With that as a basis, let's talk about flu and how we measure flu. And in the past, and even today, if you wanted to measure flu, you count patients, one by one. And today, in the United States, the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, will count patients and identify if they come to the clinic if they have flu-like symptoms. But what would that same sort of technique look like in a world of big data? Unsurprisingly, Google thought about this and decided that they were going to try to look at search queries, since they get billions every day, and see if their search queries could correlate with outbreaks of the seasonal flu in 9 different districts in the United States. And sure enough, they were able to find this. Now, a lot of people don't actually understand how it worked. Who here has heard of the Google Flu Trends initiative? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, many people have. That's good, maybe about a third of you. So by looking just at it, but they used a machine learning algorithm. It's not like somebody said, oh, cough, or sniffles. No. They simply looked at all of the searches, actually the top 200 million searches, and they ran it through 500 million mathematical models to identify which best correlated with the seasonal flu. And sure enough, they were able to find it. And Google Flu Trends, therefore, is a useful technique in epidemiology to understand outbreaks of the flu. And it's a sort of corporate philanthropy on the part of Google. But there was, about a year ago, an article in Science that basically said it didn't work so well. And that's true, there was some problems with it. But what they were able to find out was that when you took Google Flu Trends and married it with the CDC, when you took big data with the near real-time health data, which is the Centers for Disease Control actual patients, suddenly you had a better model. than you had by just looking at one or the other. So what is big data? The term now has become so exposed and so hyped in the press, and mea culpa, since I'm a journalist myself, that it's lost some of its meaning. But what it means at its core is this. There are things that you can do when you have a large body of data that you fundamentally cannot do when you're only working with smaller amounts. That the change in scale leads to a change in state. That a quantitative shift leads to a qualitative shift. Okay, that more isn't just more, that more is different. Let me give another example, and it's the example of premature babies. The most important thing to save a life for premature babies is to make sure that they don't get an infection. But you know that when you go into a healthcare setting, although they collect a lot of data, certainly they attach lots of wires and tubes to you, they don't really do anything with it. That is to say, yeah, a human being might make a decision based on a snapshot in time of what it says on the screen or on the clipboard next to the crib. But it's not like they aggregate it, that they store it, that they reanalyze it, or that they do that in real time. Well, the good news is that there are researchers in Canada that are doing that for premature babies. And what they've been able to do is look at 16 different real-time flows of data, so over 1,000 data points a second, to look for what best predicts the onset of an infection in a premature baby. And by doing so, they can spot those telltale signs that best predict a baby is going to have an infection as much as 24 hours before full-blown symptoms emerge. Right? This is data that wasn't collected before, so it was more than ever before. Right? The data is sometimes messy. Sensors are being thrown off and being reattached. And they're acting on correlations. It doesn't tell us what. It doesn't tell us why, rather. It just tells us what. We may not know the biological mechanism in place, but we do know that when we see these signs, we can act in time to save a life. Now, one reason why we have so much data in the world today is because we are collecting data on things we've always collected information on. But another reason why is we're taking things that have always been informational, and we are rendering it into a data format. We're datafying it, so to speak. So you can think of the example of location, where somebody is. Where someone is has always been a matter of information. It hasn't always been a matter of data. So take, for example, Cicero. Where is Cicero? Is he at the Senate? Is he at his writing studio? Where Cicero is a matter of information, right? And if in the Roman times, if you wanted to go and try to find out where Cicero is and well, you wouldn't have a quill, maybe you'd have a little chisel, you'd have a tablet, and you'd say your little Latin letters, Cicero, Senate, and you'd look at your hourglass on your watch, and you'd find out where he was, or your sundial. Hard problem to do, okay? Now, of course, you all know that going back for a decade, at least, somewhere in the world today, there is a database that has your location, where you've been every second of your lives for a long time. Now, the database is probably in Langley, Virginia, nevertheless, or it could be at a cell phone operator, but more likely. Nevertheless, the point is that location has become a matter of data. It's datafied. Think of the way you're sitting right now, right? The way Peter's sitting, Jim is sitting, you're sitting. It's all different, and it's a function of lots of things. Your legs, the contour of your back, your weight, the distribution of your weight. And if I were to throw 100 sensors into everyone's chair right now, I could create an index that's fairly unique to you, like a fingerprint. What could I do with this? Researchers in Tokyo are using it as a potential anti-theft device in cars. The idea is that the carjacker jumps behind the wheel, tries to stream off, and the car recognizes that a non-approved driver is speeding off. And maybe the car stops the engine automatically unless the driver puts in a password into the dashboard. These are the sorts of things we can do when we datafy more aspects of our lives. Right? We can store the data. We can share the data. But most importantly, by processing it, we can extract it for new forms of economic value. The point, though, of course, is not just some of the commercial opportunities, although they're important too. It's really about a change in mindset. It's about looking at the world in a new way. and seeing everything through the lens of data and seeing the world as a platform for the efficient collection and analysis of information to do new things. The data gives us a new form of visibility that we couldn't have before. So if we wanted to understand aid around the world, we could look at where different countries spend their money, and you could see, Kenya here, and you could see, Tanzania there. But researchers at an organization called Aid Data thought they would actually add a geolocation, a GPS tag, to where the money is actually spent, right, where it actually goes. And lo and behold, when they mapped it to Kenya, they saw some interesting things. Who would have known that all of the overseas development aid in Kenya was roughly a day trip from the Nairobi airport? Throwing up the question whether it was really intended for the recipients or for the ease of life of the givers. And if you can see the darker in the map behind me, you can see that the darker areas represent where the worst poverty is. Lo and behold, that's not where the majority of aid goes. If you were to overlay a map of the tribal areas in Kenya, you'll see something also quite interesting. To identify that certain tribes seem to be really good at collecting money, other tribes not quite as shrewd. We're seeing new forms of data philanthropy. Data for Development is an initiative run by Orange, in which they take the cell phone carrier, in which they take their data and they open it, or they anonymize it, important, and then make it available to researchers so they can run different analyses and try to identify trends and solve problems. Some of the things that they've done is looked at the use of transport networks to see if you could actually optimize the bus service in certain areas, in this case in Senegal, by looking at where people are starting their trips and ending their trips, simply by the call data records. And that takes us to one of the most interesting dimensions of how data is going to be used to the service of humanity. We all remember that about a year ago, Ebola started creeping up until it looked like it was going to be truly a pandemic. Now, we dodged that bullet, and that was great. But one of the most effective ways we could staunch Ebola by knowing where it was and where it was spreading was through something called CDRs. It stands for Call Detail Records, or Call Data Records. It's basically the metadata alongside a call that says who's calling whom, where, from when, for how long. Even weird things like how many rings took place before the call was received or not answered at all. It's pretty basic stuff, and you can anonymize it, and you can make it available to researchers, and indeed researchers have used it before. But in the midst of the crisis, the data was not given up to the epidemiological community, even though the UN tried to get it, and researchers, nonprofit researchers, tried to get it. It was one of the saddest moments that I've experienced as a journalist. And I covered the Fukushima disaster when I was the Tokyo correspondent, and I was spitting venom when I was reporting the story for The Economist, and I felt a strong honor to do so because of the people who perished during Fukushima, and I'd seen how the Japanese authorities wasted themselves in nonsensical responses and left people to terrible situations. What happened? Well, the operators, they're looking at the bottom line. It's a cost, it's a problem, there's no one who knows how to do it, so don't bother me. The regulators, look, we all know in Africa, the telecom regulator is basically a cesspool of patronage in most countries, in the same way that the postmaster in the United States up until the 1900s was basically the same sort of patronage system of politicians. So don't look to the regulators for anything, right? And then finally, the politicians, they're clueless. But you know what? Politicians are allowed to be clueless. If they really know this stuff, they're in the weeds, right? They're opt to operate at a higher level, but they weren't getting the good advice, and they didn't have the courage to actually take it on. The world got very lucky that Ebola has seemed to be faded now because of the very good work of people like Médecins Sans Frontières and others who intervened. And the call data records, although it would have been very useful to know where people are going, where the infection rates are, where the the infection might spread, at what pace it might spread, not where people are ending up, but the network hubs that they're going to get there and how long it takes them to get there. It'd be useful to have known that, and we didn't know that. But now that we're in a period where it's less panicked, is the time to do the heavy, responsible lifting of thinking about these issues so that we can actually create the prevention that we need for the future. What this requires, of course, is leadership, and not just any kind of leadership. Leadership that appreciates the value of data. Now, we're in a world as well in which the data has risks, and we have to be mindful of that. The first one, obviously, is privacy. Right? Privacy was a problem in a small data era. It's a bigger problem in the age of big data, in which so many different sorts of databases can release information that we now recognize will be private or personal data, but wasn't personal data when it was collected that way. As an example, in terms of Africa, the data would be able to show tribal areas. And we know in a lot of these countries, tribal conflict is still very close to the surface, even if it's just slightly underneath it for now. And lo and behold, you can understand the privacy implications are huge. Did Google get consent to identify where flu outbreaks were going to be? From the users who were just entering search queries? No, they didn't. And so a lot of people might say, hey, that's wrong. Likewise, in terms of risks, there's propensity, the idea that we will have algorithms that will be predicting what we're likely to do, and we may be held accountable for it. It's a little bit like thought crime. You'll be able to identify that this person has a 95% likelihood of being a shoplifter in the next, or committing a felony in the next 12 months. What should society do? Should the chief of police arrest that young man, and thereby take away his free will? Or should we, allow him to perhaps, exercise that moral choice, but do the wrong thing and commit a crime? We'll have to decide. Likewise, the call data record that is so valuable to epidemiologists are simply telling us a probability, right? It's not telling us exactly who has it or where they're really going, right? And so indeed, we may be undermining human freedom by acting on these propensities, acting on these probabilities. Finally, and most importantly, is the sense of humanity, which is to say a sense of fairness, decency, our values. Right? We need to recognize that we have to be the master of this technology, not its servant, that the data is only a simulacrum of reality. It's not the real thing, in the same way that a map is not territory. Ultimately, it's going to require responsibility. On an individual level, certainly, but because we're all here today, we can recognize that companies too will have this responsibility. Typically, we've set our default setting to one in which responsibility has meant we're not going to give up the data, because that seemed to be the correct operative response in the small data era, in which the risk of accidental disclosure was quite high and it could be very harmful. And the benefits you can get from the data was kind of meager, because after all, it was sort of small data. We couldn't process it very well. It was hard to do. I would argue we need to shift the default setting in the opposite direction. That actually, if you want to be a responsible steward of data, you have to put it into play, get it into the marketplace, for so to speak. Give it the kinetic energy that it needs to realize the value that's in that data by releasing it. Now, you have to release it responsibly. If the data has personal information, it has to be anonymous. Maybe it has to be aggregated. But the key thing is that we have to change the default setting from one of being restrictive to one of being open-minded in terms of how we collect the value, how we recognize the value of this data. Thanks a lot.